What if some of the most decisive hours of 1944 unfolded not on open beaches under 1,000 guns, but in the dark between hedges, in the pauses between footsteps, in the quiet conviction that enough small acts could change the outcome of a vast war? What if liberation began not with the thunder of Allied guns, but with the whisper of cut wires, the silence of severed telephone lines, and the careful placement of a farmer's hands around a stick of dynamite? In the summer of 1944, while the world's attention focused on the beaches of Normandy, a hidden offensive was already underway in the Celtic peninsula of Brittany. This was not a war of grand strategies drawn on maps in distant capitals. This was a war fought by bakers and fishermen, teachers and railway workers, ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice. They called themselves the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, the French Forces of the Interior, the FFI. But they were something more than their official designation suggested. They were the embodiment of a people's refusal to accept defeat, the living proof that freedom, when truly cherished, must sometimes be seized rather than granted. Brittany, the granite fist thrust into the Atlantic, had endured 4 years of occupation. Its slate-roofed villages looked inward and outward at once, fields hemmed by ancient hedges, harbours open to the world. To the occupier, it was a fortress and a staging ground. To those who lived there, it was home, and home demanded a reckoning. To understand Brittany's liberation, we must first understand its imprisonment. When German forces swept through France in the summer of 1940, Brittany's strategic value was immediately apparent. This granite peninsula punching into the Atlantic held 4 major ports: Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Saint-Malo. Its harbours became bases for the U-boat wolf packs that stalked Allied convoys. Its coastline became part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. For 4 years, the Bretons endured the suffocating grip of occupation. Their young men were shipped to labour camps in Germany. Their harvests fed the Wehrmacht. Their ancient Celtic culture was suppressed beneath the jackboot of Nazi ideology, but beneath the surface of enforced compliance, something was stirring. Resistance seldom begins with heroic trumpet calls. It begins with the ache of what has been taken. A son sent east for labour he never chose. A harvest commandeered. A language laughed at. A stranger's boots outside the schoolhouse where arithmetic is still taught, but now under a flag not your own. In kitchens lit by low bulbs and in barns that smelled of hay and oil, people listened for a voice that travelled across water and darkness, a voice that said simply, "You are not alone." Marie-Claire Dubois was 19 when she made her choice. The daughter of a schoolteacher in the coastal village of Pluha, she had watched German soldiers march past her window every morning for 3 years, but it wasn't until her brother was taken for forced labour that watching became acting. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes," Marie-Claire would later recall, her soft voice carrying the weight of memory. "We were just angry that our country had been stolen from us, angry that our families had been torn apart, but anger, when it's shared, becomes something more powerful than fear." In those years before the summer that would change everything, hundreds of small threads were woven across the Breton countryside. A railway worker at Carhaix who learned to slow freight trains by a handful of minutes here and there, minutes that added up to hours. A parish priest who rode a wobbly bicycle between villages with papers hidden beneath a breviary, stopping to bless a newborn and to pass a name along. A student, suddenly older than her years, whose daily ride to the market became a courier's circuit, letting resistance circles find each other without ever speaking more than necessary. By 1943, these scattered acts of defiance had begun to coalesce into something approaching an organisation. The FFI in Brittany was a mosaic of different movements: the Armée Secrète, the communist FTP, the military-minded ORA. They disagreed on politics, on tactics, sometimes on fundamental questions of strategy, but they shared 2 things: an unshakable hatred of the occupier and an unwavering belief in a free France. They called themselves many things: maquisards in the scrub and forest, patriots in the lanes, a nuisance in the reports of those who underestimated them. But gradually, these scattered sparks took on a single shadow. The Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, the FFI, was never a neat organization. It was a conversation strained across fear and urgency, a coalition that included former soldiers who still folded maps with military precision, dock workers whose strong hands knew knots and bolts better than weapons at first, and young idealists who mistook courage for invulnerability until experience brought them closer to the truth. Their lifeline to the outside world came in the form of Allied airdrops, precious cargoes of weapons, ammunition, and radio equipment parachuted into remote fields under cover of darkness. On favoured nights, when moon and cloud drew a curtain thick enough to hide intentions, canopies opened over fields that had known only seed and harvest. Cylinders buried in cabbage rows yielded radios and rifles, bandages and hope. Each drop was a wager on secrecy, on luck, on a farmer's oath. Each cache was a question pressed into the ground. What will we dare when the hour comes? But these drops were irregular, often insufficient, and fraught with danger. German patrols were vigilant, and a single mistake could mean capture, torture, and death. Every successful operation required not just courage, but meticulous planning and intimate knowledge of local terrain that only natives possessed. The hour arrived with a rumble that began elsewhere. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, coded messages crackled across the airwaves to resistance cells throughout occupied France. For the FFI in Brittany, the message was clear. The hour of liberation had arrived. Brittany awoke not all at once, but in quickening pulses. The initial mission was sabotage, cut communications, destroy supply lines, disrupt German movements. Across Brittany, FFI teams launched coordinated attacks. Railway bridges exploded in balls of flame. Telephone cables were severed. Power stations went dark. Every act, however small, contributed to the chaos behind German lines. Wires fell silent. Roads once simple became uncertain. Rails buckled, where a saboteur had taught himself enough to make steel do what he needed it to do. A convoy entered a lane walled in by green and did not emerge. A switchyard looked normal until nothing left it on time anymore, but sabotage came at a terrible price. For every successful operation, German forces retaliated with brutal efficiency. Villages suspected of harbouring resistance fighters were burned. Hostages were taken and executed. Entire families disappeared into the Nazi prison system. Every act had weight, and with weight came consequence. Those who chose action understood what they invited. Reprisals that arrived like storms, blunt and indiscriminate. The moral calculus was agonizing. Every act of resistance potentially endangered innocent lives. Every attack might trigger reprisals against people who had no connection to the FFI. How many could be sacrificed for the promise of freedom? How many risks could be asked of a village? How many sacrifices could be justified by a ledger that balanced somewhere far from any single kitchen table? Jacques Potvin understood these mathematics of sacrifice better than most. We knew that every bridge we destroyed might save Allied lives in Normandy, he would later write, his steady voice carrying underlying tension. But we also knew that every explosion might cost the lives of our neighbours. The mathematics of resistance are written in blood. Men and women who led cells in Brittany learned to calculate with the cold clarity war imposes. To cut this line here saves a platoon there. To delay that train now might spare strangers you will never meet. They knew that when the day broke over Normandy, German orders would surge west toward Brittany's ports. Their task, as they saw it, was to make every road a detour, every timetable a rumour, every garrison slightly less certain of itself. Near Morlaix, Penven led a team that successfully destroyed 3 crucial railway bridges, cutting the main supply line between Brest and the Norman front. But of the 12 men who attacked those bridges, only 4 returned. Penven himself died holding off German reinforcements while his demolitions expert completed the mission. He was 23 years old. In Saint-Nazaire, fisherman-turned-resistance leader Paul Moyes faced a different challenge. The submarine pens were among the most heavily fortified positions in occupied Europe. When his team found their original plan compromised, Moyes made a desperate decision. They would attack underwater, planting charges on the concrete supports of the submarine pens themselves. "We worked in freezing water for 6 hours," Moyes recalled years later, his gravelly voice carrying a hint of pride. 6 hours of knowing that discovery meant certain death, but we also knew that every U-boat we kept in port was one less hunting Allied convoys. The mathematics were simple, even if the execution was not. The charges didn't destroy the submarine pens. German engineering was too solid for that. But they created enough structural damage to put the facilities out of action for weeks. More importantly, they demonstrated to German commanders that nowhere was truly safe from the FFI attack. In the south, in wooded country where paths twisted among heather and oak, a camp grew. Tents beneath branches, mess tins scuffed by hurried meals, faces sunburnt by days spent drilling with weapons that felt too light for the task ahead. They were joined by outsiders who were not outsiders. French soldiers who had crossed the Channel and returned by parachute, experienced hands who had learned in the hard school of other operations what it meant to organize war in a place that must not be caught having organized anything at all. But perhaps the most audacious operation was already underway near the ancient forest of Paimpont. Marie-Claire Dubois and her cell had been tasked with something that seemed impossible: capturing and holding a German ammunition depot long enough for Allied aircraft to destroy it. The attack began at dawn with a diversionary mortar barrage from the north. As German forces rushed to respond to what appeared to be the main assault, Marie-Claire led the real attack from the south, using a forgotten drainage tunnel that ran beneath the compound's defences. Emerging from the tunnel directly inside the ammunition storage area, Marie-Claire's team had minutes to plant their charges before German reinforcements could respond. But as they prepared to escape, disaster struck. A German patrol had discovered their route. They were trapped. The timer was running, Marie-Claire remembered decades later, her voice still heavy with the weight of that moment. We had 3 minutes. The Germans were climbing up through the tunnel behind us. I looked at my team. These were my friends, my neighbours, people I'd grown up with. And I realised we weren't going to make it out. With German forces closing in and the timer counting down, Marie-Claire faced the most difficult decision of her young life. The charges were set, the mission was nearly complete, but her team couldn't escape in time. The explosion at Paimpont was visible from 20 miles away. It destroyed enough German ammunition to supply 3 divisions for a month. Marie-Claire survived, thrown clear by the initial blast, but 5 of her 8-person team did not. They had paid the ultimate price for their country's freedom. But even as the FFI bled for every small victory, the strategic situation was changing rapidly. In late July, Operation Cobra shattered the German lines in Normandy. General Patton's Third Army, unleashed at last, came racing west toward Brittany. The peninsula's deep-water ports, especially Brest, were suddenly crucial to sustaining the Allied advance. The first encounters between FFI units and American forces were often moments of mutual surprise. American soldiers, expecting to find only enemy forces, were met by armed civilians wearing tricolour armbands and pointing the way to German positions. These irregulars possessed invaluable intelligence and intimate knowledge of local terrain. Men and women emerged from cover not merely with rifles, but with notebooks, sketches of arcs of fire, lists of places to avoid, shortcuts that the maps did not show, because those paths had been family knowledge long before wars taught outsiders to care about them. It is said that sometimes a single person walking ahead of a column, hand raised, can save hours and lives. In Brittany that summer, it happened often. With American forces advancing into Brittany, the FFI hidden offensive erupted into open warfare. Thousands of partisans emerged from their forest camps and safe houses, launching coordinated attacks on German garrisons across the peninsula. This was no longer sabotage, this was liberation. The fighting was often ferocious. German forces, many of them hardened veterans, fought with desperate tenacity. The FFI, armed with a mix of outdated rifles, captured German weapons, and airdropped Sten guns, compensated for their lack of heavy weaponry with audacity and local knowledge. Some towns rose before columns arrived, with barricades made of ordinary things, farm carts, barrels, furniture that had another purpose yesterday, and with courage that stares down a machine gun because the weight of the last 4 years presses you forward. In other places, the calculation was different. Wait until the armoured vehicles are at the edge of town, then strike at the posts and pillboxes, whose arcs of fire had been mapped weeks ago. Town after town fell to the FFI advance. Guingamp, a strategic crossroads, was liberated after an 18-hour battle that saw FFI fighters using medieval church passages to outflank German defenders. The victory proved that the resistance had evolved from a sabotage network into a capable military force. One town, a crossroads centered on a square where children had chased each other for generations, became a textbook. The defenders had placed machine guns in predictable places. The FFI had already charted a way, beneath and around. What in the morning looked like a defensive geometry turned by evening into a trap for those who believed stone alone can organize a defense. By nightfall, a banner hung where another had been. The final phase became a model for cooperation between Allied forces and local resistance. The FFI provided intelligence, guides, and additional manpower. American forces contributed heavy weapons, air support, and logistical capabilities. Together, they achieved what neither could have accomplished alone. But liberation came at a terrible cost. Saint-Malo, the historic walled city, was reduced to rubble in a desperate German defense. The urban fights at the great ports were a different story. There, the enemy assembled its hard men and dug in among walls that already looked like ruins. Brest required weeks of bloody urban warfare before falling. Streets without corners left unbroken. Basements where a sniper's single bullet could empty an intersection of movement, stone that remembered older wars and learned a new one. The FFI role here changed. No longer the primary knife, but the hand that points, the eyes that see, the runners who carry the message that a certain alley connects to a courtyard, that connects to a stair, that bypasses what looks unassailable. That knowledge can save a squad. Sometimes it saved more. Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, designated fortress pockets, held out until the very end of the war. They were ringed and watched. Those rings included voices from local farms and villages, brought now into a strange parody of siegecraft, watching, marking, relaying, sustaining a tension that would endure into spring. There is a kind of courage in waiting too, a willingness to stand the long watch so that others can move forward. By September 1944, German resistance in Brittany had collapsed everywhere except the heavily fortified coastal cities. The peninsula was effectively liberated, and the FFI had played the decisive role in that liberation. They had proven that occupied peoples could liberate themselves. With liberation came not just celebration, but immense challenges. Brittany was scarred by war. Infrastructure lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and thousands had paid the ultimate price. The FFI, having fought as guerrillas, now faced the complex task of transitioning to peacetime roles. We cannot speak about courage without speaking about cost. Of the estimated 20,000 Bretons who served with the FFI during the Liberation Campaign, over 3,000 were killed and many more wounded. Entire villages had lost their young men to the resistance struggle. The price of freedom had been paid in the currency of lives. Cost was counted in the starred gaps on family trees, in farm fields run by fewer hands, in names spoken at ceremonies that try to make words carry what words cannot. The transition was not always smooth. Who would govern the liberated territories? How would former resistance fighters adapt to civilian life? What would happen to collaborators? These questions had no easy answers, and the solutions were often imperfect, sometimes unjust. There were, too, the costs that do not wear uniforms, pain that walks home when power changes hands and seeks the old balance by punishing those who were near it. People expected us to go back to being the same people we were before the war, Marie Claire reflected years later, her older voice carrying the weight of experience. But how could we? We had seen things, done things, lost friends in ways that changed us forever. The war was over, but we were still fighting to understand what we had become. The FFI self had to transform, to move from a loose weave of war-forged units to the formal braid of an army requires surrendering some of what made it so quick on the edges. Some found pride in the new structure. Some found a hollow in it. Uniforms issued where armbands had been. Ranks formalized where influence had come from merit earned in the green lanes. Today, the legacy of Brittany's hidden offensive endures in countless small memorials scattered across the peninsula. The names of the fallen are remembered, their courage celebrated. But questions remain. Has their story been fully told? Has the true extent of their sacrifice and their pivotal role been adequately recognized? There is a temptation, afterward, to tell stories as if they were always meant to arrive at the ending we admire. History resists this. In Brittany, as elsewhere, little depended on inevitability, and much depended on individuals who chose to risk one more act that could have failed and did not, or failed and still accomplished enough to make the next act possible. We should acknowledge, too, how much remains unknown and may always remain. Who passed the word to a patrol that found a camp in the woods that day? Why did one train with essential cargo sail through unharmed while another, less important, caught every delay? These uncertainties do not weaken the story, they are part of its truth. Wars are fought under fog, and the fog never fully lifts. The FFI's achievement in Brittany had profound implications beyond the peninsula itself. They proved that resistance movements could evolve into effective military forces, that ordinary citizens could accomplish extraordinary things when fighting for their freedom, and that liberation could not simply be granted, it had to be seized. The FFI, an offensive in Brittany, altered the geometry of an entire campaign. It drew men away from other fronts, turned depots into traps, gave an army eyes and ears upon arrival, and stiffened the will of the living under occupation to choose risk over resignation when the moment came. The men and women who did this did not share a single background or a single language of politics. They shared a place, and they shared a conviction that the place belonged to them enough to make danger preferable to surrender. The hidden offensive in Brittany was more than a military campaign. It was a testament to the power of ordinary people to change the course of history when they find the courage to act. Their sacrifice reminds us that freedom is not a gift, it is an achievement. It is not guaranteed, it must be defended. And it is not free, it must be earned by each generation that wishes to possess it. We are left with images that refuse to fade, a woman handing a map to a stranger in a foreign uniform and saying, in her own language, "Go here and not there, trust me." A farmer who spends the night in a ditch because he must count trucks and notes to himself which ones return lighter. Boys too young to be there binding wounds of men who looked old to them because war ages anyone it touches. The story ends, as all stories of war do, with a quiet that at first seems foreign. The loud has ceased. The necessary frictions of survival are replaced by other frictions. Paperwork in town halls, arguments about credit and blame, trials that try, however imperfectly, to draw lines between what society will forgive and what it cannot. What remains to ask? Perhaps this: have we truly measured the weight of what a few thousand did for a million? Have we practiced remembering in a way that honours not only the dramatic but the quiet, the breakfast interrupted, the long walk in rain to deliver a note, the patience of those who did not break, and this, too. If it falls to us to face shadows again, will we recognise the moment when whispers must become action? In the end, what liberates is not always the charge, but sometimes the delay. Not always the thunder of armies, but sometimes the whisper in the dark. The FFI, Brittany, understood this truth, and in understanding it, they wrote their names in the permanent record of human courage. The argument of this story is simple and hard. Freedom can be helped ashore by ships and delivered by armoured columns, but it is not alive until those who live in its streets and fields recognise it and choose it for themselves. In the Breton summer of 1944, they did. They made their peninsula a place where hazards grew for an occupying army and advantages grew for the ones coming to free it. Where the land meets the Atlantic, there are places where, on some evenings, a light sweeps across dark water, returning again and again in a faithful rhythm older than any war. The people of that coast have long known how to look for it and steer by it. In that summer, the light was not only at sea. It flickered in fields and barns and narrow streets, carried by those who believed they had the right to be free and proved it. The ones we speak of now did not ask to be remembered. They asked for their home back and did the work that request entailed. In Brittany, the granite remembers. The sea, which is older than any war, keeps its own counsel. The hidden offensive that helped free that place lives at the edge of sight, easier to sense than to touch. It is there in the names carved low on village monuments, in the sudden hush that takes a crowd at the mention of a year, in the pride with which an old man straightens when a flag passes by. We can end where we began, with the quiet image of someone we do not know by name, preparing to do something small and dangerous because the time for waiting has ended. The record will remain incomplete, but the outline is clear enough to stand judgment. Brittany was not merely liberated, it participated in its own liberation. The FFI, hidden offensive, was not spectacle. It was the steady unmaking of an occupation from within, so that when the liberators arrived, they found ground that recognized them and made way.